On the phone is Brian Knappenberger. He is the filmmaker of the new Aaron Swartz documentary, The Internet's Own Boy, the story of Aaron Swartz. Welcome to the program, Brian.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And Brian, as you know, I said when I called you to start this, the film is fantastic, and it is incredibly moving, and in some respects, just it's difficult to watch because Aaron represented, I think, such a tremendous amount of promise, and he left us at such a young age. It's very impressive, and I should say that I knew Aaron not well, but in fact, I spent. He was in this very studio a couple of times as he was setting up with Ben Wickler, Ben Wickler's podcast,
Right.
and
Right.
there's at the time, I didn't really know, and I think this is the thing that's very impressive about the film, is really just sort of, I didn't really know him. He was a very unassuming guy when you would meet him in this context, and I think also he was going through this long process of facing these criminal charges. But let's just start. I'm curious as to what led you to make this documentary.
Well, I was my previous film was called We Are Legion: The Story of the Hacktivists, which was kind of a historical look at the hacktivist non-group Anonymous, and sort of where they came from, the roots of it, and the kinds of activity that they were engaged in, pretty much from around 2007, 8, 9, to when we made the film. I think it released in 2012, and so I was on a panel talking about hackers with Aaron's ex-girlfriend, Quinn Norton, about a week after Aaron died in New York City, and it was very sad. Everybody at this event sort of knew who he was and seemed to have a story about him, and so I started filming right away. And it was at the beginning of this period of time in which there was this huge wave of anger and sympathy and frustration that was coming out of the internet, even from people that didn't know him, were obviously sort of clearly moved by this story, and including people that were far outside the kind of tech communities in which he was I guess, sort of quasi-celebrity. So, I was interested in it, and I was myself moved by his story. I had actually lost a friend to suicide about 4 months before that, so there was part of that was in my, still kind of grappling with that. But I just found his personal story so kind of interesting and inspiring and moving and ultimately tragic, and an interesting way to kind of. He was involved in so many things that I think were really relevant issues of our time, that in telling his story, I can see that it would be a way of also getting at these bigger picture issues that I think are so important.
And it is, it is amazing how much, just how many things he was involved in what was a very short life. So I mean, just give us a sense of when Aaron began. I mean, he was obviously an incredibly intelligent child, but it is there are points in the film early on as it discusses how Aaron almost I guess became introduced to this online community. I'm not even sure what to refer to the community that he sort of entered into, but it was the leading edge of what people were doing on the internet. Just talk about some of those early, I guess, entrances into that world.
Yeah, I mean, he at a very young age he took to the internet, and he was really interested in how information flows online, how and was interested in being a part of these kind of groups that were working with the flow of information online. One notable example early is the RSS working group, right? So RSS powers all kinds of things. I'm sure maybe even your podcast.
Indeed.
So this is a critical kind of thing that was being developed, and he was a part of a working group. And as he's dealing with people, as you said, much older than him, in his 30s, 40s, 50s, these are internet dignitaries, luminaries. He's contributing substantively to this group. And at one point, one of them asks him, well, we'd love for you to come out and talk about this stuff in person. Come out to a face-to-face meeting, and let's discuss this stuff further. And he says, I'm not sure, my mom would let me. I'm only 13 years old. So obviously this was both shocking and also this made them want to meet him even more. But that sort of characterized his early life. I think he was frustrated with school. We have a piece in the film and archival footage of him talking about his frustrations with the normal kind of educational system and how he felt it kind of held students back, and homework was kind of a sham, and he was clearly more sort of intellectually curious than his schooling. It felt frustrated by it. So he really took to these kind of internet groups and became a part of these communities that were developing freedom of information on the web.
Yeah, I mean, I think the interview with Cory Doctorow at that point, I think he's the one who sort of registers the sort of the surprise of realizing that they have been these people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, like you say, 50s, had been engaging with someone who they immediately perceived to be, they simply assumed that he was of a similar age. And to find out that he was only 13, of course, sort of piqued their interest that much more. And that moment, I think, is also just sort of, in some ways, that moment of discovery of him is almost a metaphor for the entire film and his entire life, because it seems like at different times he is revealing himself to different communities, and people are discovering just what this guy was capable of doing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so that period of time really led him, and I think sort of defined how his life went. I mean, he went on to be the technical kind of architect of Creative Commons, and became a co-founder of Reddit. And when Reddit was sold to Condé Nast, that made him a very rich 19-year-old. And from there, he kind of branched off and went into these other issues, social justice issues, political organizing, grassroots organizing using internet, that sort of thing, and really sort of jumped into a very different world with both feet.
And that turn is also, I mean, I think sort of also, I think, very surprising in this day and age, because you don't. I can't think of anyone else who has so fundamentally sort of turned their back on what was a path that could have led to just a tremendous amount of wealth. And, I think there's plenty of examples of people who've gone on to make this money and then sort of, take a slice of their life or a slice of their money and reinvest it into some of these issues. Maybe they are sort of pure social justice issues, or they are issues that are political but still related to the tech world. But he did something that was, just incredibly rare in that sense. He just basically turned his back on all of it and dedicated himself to just full-on activism.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things he did right away is he became an intern in Alan Grayson's office, just in a congressional office. And, I actually I was in D.C. recently, I talked to some staffers there, and they're like, yeah, just millionaire kid just became an intern with us, who was really curious about what they were doing. and really wanted to learn a new system in which he didn't have sort of natural skills at. I mean, he sort of it was something that was outside what he'd been working on. It's a remarkable turn. I think that the norm in Silicon Valley is to sort of stay on the kind of money machine, really. It's the idea that the build to flip culture, right, where you do a startup and you sell it and then you try to do it again. And Aaron seemed, from his writings and from people that you talked to, just kind of frustrated with that world. That he didn't allow for this sort of political exploration that he wanted to go into. And in Silicon Valley, there's a kind of there's a cliche, right? Make the world a better place. I mean, every app, every startup says that, right? I think for Aaron, it was about looking with a little more clear-eyed focus at what makes the world bad to begin with. Asking that question, well, what is it that you are identifying as being bad, and then how do you create an action that addresses that issue, and then how do you measure the effect that action has had so that the next time you do it, you can tweak your approach and be more effective. I mean, the minute you have the intellectual curiosity to ask those questions about making the world a better place at that level, you've kind of ripped the veil from the Silicon Valley kind of nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, it is amazing because it's the same sort of, I guess, methodology, right? I mean, it's the same MO. You see a problem, and you apply all of these principles to fixing it. It's just that for some reason, he, instead of saying like, "Hey, how can we make getting a taxi cab more efficient?" or how can we increase the efficiency of I don't know, of ordering food online. It was social justice issues, and I should say, at the time of his death, we talked about him quite a bit on this program, and this audience will be familiar with a lot of the people who are in the film, more so from a political perspective. I mean, when he went to Grayson's office, he was working with Matt Stoller, who we've spoken with on this program. David Sirota appears in your film, who we've talked on this program. He co-founded with Adam Green the PCCC, which has been instrumental in the election and the sort of the support for people like Elizabeth Warren, and so it was such a sort of a dramatic breaking of that mold, and even the people. And there are other people, and then he goes on, of course, to work with Lawrence Lessig. I mean, talk about his relationship with Lessig, because this audience is both familiar with Lessig from his work years ago on Creative Commons, but Lessig did something in some ways similar. At one point, he decided, I'm going to, I think it was maybe 5 or 6 years ago, he said, I've spent the past 10 years trying to work out a new type of copyright. Now I'm going to try and fix what's wrong with our politics.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So, Aaron sort of first was working with Larry in the Creative Commons days. But Larry tells a very moving story. Larry who has been a really key figure in the copyright sort of world, in this sort of reform movement, central really. He credits Aaron with a turn that he took towards trying to get money out of politics, and it's a turn that Larry is still on with the May Day campaign and this kind of super PAC to end all super PACs. That he's working on right now. That actually people should go and check it out. They're in their sort of final home stretch of a big kind of crowdfunding campaign. I think that's mayday.org.
.us actually. In fact, sometime this week we're going to replay an interview I did with him on another show from last week about that about the May Day PAC. But
okay, cool. So that's in the throes right now, so people can go there if they're curious. But yeah, you're right. So Larry credits Aaron for making this this turn. Really sort of questioning where his sort of energy is best spent, and really kind of opening his eyes to this new sort of direction. Larry, if you listen to him talk about it, is very, very sort of tells this kind of moving story about that. And later said that called Aaron a mentor rather than the other way around. So obviously he was very influenced by Aaron.
Yeah, that dynamic is fascinating to me, because here you have a guy who has argued in front of the Supreme Court, who has marshaled this massively adopted sort of new form of copyright in the Creative Commons, and perceives himself there was clearly to the extent that there was that mentoring relationship, it was counterintuitive from what you would expect from looking from the outside.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then Aaron also was involved in the fellowship with Larry at Harvard at the time that he was arrested.
And it was so let's talk about that element of it, because when I met Aaron, one would not be aware that this was going on. I mean, if you did not know, if I had not read about it and I had not sort of heard secondhand, in my interactions with him, it seemed to be very much compartmentalized, and and the film makes it sort of clear that he was constantly sort of involved in trying to sort of provide some type of firewall between these two things that were going on in his life, and also in between, I guess, himself and these troubles and his family and friends, to the extent that he could.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I hear that from a lot of people that were close to Aaron, that he was sort of compartmentalizing a bit, that he was obviously going, really at the same time that he's involved in the SOPA kind of protests and the advocacy around SOPA, he is going through this kind of private hell with this prosecutor that not a lot of his friends really knew about, or if they knew about it, they just knew, just the very, very small amount of what he was going through. And he didn't make any public, really obvious sort of public statements about it, except for there was a press release that he released through Demand Progress that talked a little bit about the case, but it struck me that I was following lots of cases of quote unquote hackers who had kind of run afoul of the law, and so I was aware of Aaron's case and was following it a little bit. But it was really striking to me that not that many people were, particularly in comparison to some of the other more notable hacker cases that have gotten a lot of press. And I wondered about that, actually. But making the film, I realized it was almost all of that was really because of the pressure that the prosecutors were putting on him. They really took advantage of any vulnerability. If they suspected his friends knew something, they'd call his friends in. He worried about that, and I think he was right to worry about that. They were very, very aggressive. And so he was reticent to talk to the people close to him. And that one Demand Progress press release, the prosecutor later told the MIT report that they thought of that as a wild internet campaign. They called it a wild internet campaign. And if you look at the press releases, there's not much to it. And personally, having made a film about Anonymous, I feel like I have seen some wild internet campaigns, and that I can attest was not one. So any attempt that he had to reach out, I think was met with additional pressure from the prosecutors, and that further isolated them into this private hell. Even while he was carrying on these kind of rousing, more public battles.
Well, yeah, I want to circle back to that in a moment because one thing that did occur to me, as I was watching the film, because I think at the time, I was aware that there was sort of peripheral questions as to like, why isn't there a bigger campaign? And there was some sense that there was a concern that this prosecutor, and we'll talk about the prosecutor in a moment, but would interpret that as a sort of it would create a face-saving situation for the prosecutor, and they seem to have adopted that very innocuous press release as being that sort of almost like a challenge in some way, and of course, you're referencing, I think, Jeremy Hammond's case. In Barrett Brown's case, these are other sort of
right.
They have followed a slightly different attack, and in some respects, what they did was, or I don't know, at least the reasons why Barrett Brown was pursued and Jeremy Hammond were pursued were sort of articulated in a slightly different way by the government, and I wonder if in some ways, if you had a sense, or if there was any sense as you were talking to people that maybe had they gone even further, because he was basically running out of money, and I think this was something that was, I mean, he had basically drained all the money that he had made from Reddit, and in the film, his father talks about how it was a financial burden on the family as well, and they couldn't run a sort of a broad online campaign to raise funds because they were afraid of antagonizing the prosecutors. Is there a sense, did you get a sense as you were talking to people that maybe from a strategic standpoint, I don't want this to be crude, but they should have even gone even bigger so that, it's almost like if it's small enough, we can quash it. If it's quiet enough, the prosecutor sort of had free reign to do this. But if it's that much bigger, all of a sudden it requires more scrutiny.
Yes, you mean bigger on the part of Aaron and getting the word out.
Yes.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's a natural question because Aaron was obviously so good at explaining sort of technical issues. He was obviously so good at these kind of, had these, prodigious kind of organizing skills. It does seem like an obvious thing to ask. I think, when talking to his friends and trying to understand it a little more deeply, I think there's a lot of things going on. I think he had a very real, there was a very real sense that he was going to implicate that his friends could be implicated. That he was being very, very careful about what he was saying to them, or the kinds of communications he was having. He was worried about being surveilled. He was worried about being followed. He was worried about the FBI searching his house. He also had, as maybe an aspect of his personality, was that he didn't necessarily want to be a burden. That kind of comes up a lot in various interviews, that he didn't want to burden his friends. That he didn't want. There seemed to be a kind of lack of a willingness to sort of to talk about it, to put any weight on his friends, just even kind of emotionally. I think there's a number of things. It is easy to see a scenario where he goes bigger and gets a lot more kind of public support for it. But I think he was worried, as were people around him, that this would invite more anger from the prosecutors. And I think there's justification for thinking that.
The aspect of him, and I hadn't really sort of, and I think. It's very hard to, I mean, he was a guy who was clearly very ethical, and he clearly was also sort of very self-sufficient in some ways, I think. And what I was always was struck by, and it was reiterated in the film, is that none of these people who were so close to him could really say with an assuredness what he was going to do with these JSTOR articles. I mean, I don't know that we've actually touched upon what it was that he was being convicted for, but essentially what he was doing was logging in via a cleaning closet, some type of utility closet at MIT. At MIT, they have access to the JSTOR documents, which are these academic journals that are published online, but their access is very limited to people who are in universities or pay a fee. And he was downloading them, and nobody can really say what he was going to do with it. Talk about the different things that he could have been using them and why people, hypothesize on what he might have been doing with them. But it's also fascinating to me that even after his death, it's clear that he never really was 100% explicit with people what he was going to do. He wasn't. And so, it makes sense that he might not have said it beforehand, but one would have thought, like, all I was going to do was X, but he never wanted to put anybody in a position of having that knowledge that could in some way compromise them.
That's right. He was very quiet about that. That goes, I think, to him not wanting to bring his friends into it to some degree. Although he did talk to a few friends, and they sort of some confided me, sort of without wanting to do it on camera with it. Others sort of one Carl Malamud actually speculates a little bit in the film. But as for the question is why somebody would download 4.7 million academic journal articles from the online service JSTOR. It is an open question because he didn't do anything with them before he was arrested, and he never had a public trial. He had died before the case went to trial, so presumably some of this would have come out then, possibly. But there are three basic reasons. Number one is maybe the silliest, that he would have tried to sell them. I don't think anybody that looks at this case would take that seriously. These are things like the 1860 Journal of Botany, not something with what you might call like a big street value.
And we should say, this is a guy who really had the ability at any time that he wanted, could have easily applied his skills to making a lot more money than one could get from selling those type of journals.
Yeah. So I think that's silly on its face to most people. The second one is that he might have been just dumping them online. Of course, that is actually consistent with what he did with Pacer. He did download those documents and put them online. And it is actually consistent with some things that he wrote, the Guerrilla Open Access Manifesto, but although that was years earlier. And it was also consistent with some things that he said, a speech at the University of Illinois and things like that we play in the film, in which he is sort of deeply upset by this system that we have, where researchers have to kind of hand over their copyrights to these multi-billion-dollar corporations, and then the universities have to pay subscriptions, and even if you come to them and you're not a member of the university, it could cost you $50, $60, $70 a pop to get a journal from JSTOR. This is offensive to the people in the open access movement. The idea that knowledge, particularly taxpayer-funded knowledge, would be locked up in an ivory tower far away from people that want it or need it or could use it to do presumably great things, make medicines for people, early detection tests, things like that. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is conducting research on funding of those articles that may have led to biased results. So corruption in research. There's a lot of
and what he did with Pacer,
that.
What he did with the Pacer documents was sort of a precedent for that theory.
Actually, no. The Pacer documents he dumped online on a website called Recap, which is Pacer backwards. Pacer is the government documents that he believes should just be open to the public, and he's right, they should. He did do something though with the Westlaw legal database.
Right. Okay. Yes.
He downloaded the Westlaw legal database and he analyzed it for corporate funding that led to biased results. And there's a pretty good chance that he was doing the same thing in JSTOR, particularly in the area of climate change. That came up enough. Again, only Carl Malamud speculates about this in the film, but that came up enough in other places that I began to give it some credibility. And it's interesting. And in the case of the Westlaw legal documents, he never released any of those, none of those materials. So those are the three things. I think that they're interesting. The last two, it could have been some combination thereof, but that would be consistent with his previous behavior.
We could talk about this further, and frankly, I'm not convinced that I could do an interview that would do justice to this film. To be totally honest with you, I mean, and I think part of it is because I found it very emotional and revealing about a guy that I knew, but not very well. And so, all I can say is there's a lot more to this story about government overreach and the attempt to make Aaron an example of and to enhance, I think, a prosecutor's career. And it ultimately perhaps mingled with other aspects about Aaron's personality, drove him to take his own life. And so I can't encourage people enough to watch this film. Brian, where can people view it?
June 27th. Tomorrow is the big opening day, and we're opening pretty much everywhere. Limited theatrical release. I think we're in 20 cities, but we're going video on demand in iTunes and Xbox and lots of different places. And we also, as a part of the release, we're doing a Vimeo release that is a Creative Commons version of the film. So in the spirit of Aaron and the principles he was fighting for with Creative Commons, that version is non-commercial share-alike attribution, unported license.
Well, like I say, the film is both inspirational and enraging and very sad. And so, Brian, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about it.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Let me just add, we had to cut that a little bit early because Brian had to go. There are a lot of other issues about the film that I wanted to get into in terms of this prosecutorial overreach and the subsequent attempts to reform the Computer Fraud Abuse Act, which was the basis of his prosecution. There were attempts in Congress to amend this law in the form of something called Aaron's Law. It has essentially gone, sadly, nowhere. But watch the film, and you will have a sense of just the sort of the sheer tragedy of this, and you will come to realize that anyone in a position to really complain about their property being copied or inappropriately downloaded essentially dropped their charges, and yet the prosecution continued. It raises all sorts of issues that we have talked about on this program in terms of selective prosecution, about the rule of law for some, real problems that exist in the incentive structure for prosecutors. But it also is very inspiring to see how much Aaron was able to achieve it's amazing to watch what he's able to achieve in terms of technical things, but also in the social realm. I mean, my recollection of watching Aaron work was having him in this studio and talking to Ben Wickler about one of the challenges that we had on this program in doing any type of radio and sort of working on a clock, and I could not find a clock that was accurate. And I just watched him sit down and just create a script that would, just the basics of a script that would sort of count down that would repeatedly count down segments. And, you know, I didn't think that much of it, but it really was a sort of a metaphor for the way that he approached not just technical problems, but social problems. So, again, I can't encourage the watching of that film more. And so I hope you check it out. It is, by the time that you hear this interview, it will be available in just about every format that Brian talked about.